How could a soldier survive alone in the jungle for nearly 30 years, waging a war that the world had already left behind? This is a jaw-dropping, mind-bending story of Hiroo Onoda, the man who refused to surrender.
I became an officer and I received an order. If I could not carry it out, I would feel shame. I am very competitive.
He didn't just fight in the war, he fought long after everyone else had stopped. I mean, he didn't just miss the memo that the war ended, he completely ignored it for almost 3 decades. He was so committed to his mission that he ignored reality itself. For almost 3 decades, he lived in survival mode, outsmarting the jungle and anyone who tried to tell him the war was done. Onoda's story is wild, unbelievable, and honestly, a bit heartbreaking. And it all started with orders he just couldn't let go of. But first, let's see who Hiroo Onoda was and how he got into all of this. He was born in 1922 in a small town called Kainan, nestled in Japan's Wakayama prefecture. He grew up in a big, bustling family, one of 7 kids, so you can imagine the noise and chaos at home. Life in those days was pretty straightforward. Japan was a country with deep traditions, and Onoda's family wasn't much different. They were hardworking, and like many families back then, they expected their kids to be disciplined and respectful. Now, Hiroo wasn't just any kid. He was known for being determined, a bit headstrong, and always up for a challenge. This wasn't just some passing phase. This was who he was to his core. When he got older, he started working as a salesman in China, which wasn't exactly the most glamorous job, but it was a way to make a living and see a bit of the world. But life had something else in store for him. In 1942, with World War II in full swing, the Japanese government started drafting men into the military. Hiroo, just 20 years old at the time, got the call. Like many young men of his generation, he didn't hesitate. This was his duty, his way to serve his country. So he left his life as a salesman behind and joined the Japanese Imperial Army. He was assigned to the 61st Infantry Regiment, and after some time, he got transferred to the 28th Infantry Regiment. Now, the army life wasn't a walk in the park. It was tough, grueling even, but Hiroo took to it like a fish to water. The military saw something in him, a kind of resilience and resourcefulness that wasn't common in everyone. So instead of just sending him off to the front lines, they decided to train him in something special: guerrilla warfare and intelligence. This wasn't your typical training. It was intense, secretive, and required a lot of brain power. They were teaching him how to survive in the wild, how to gather intelligence, and most importantly, how to fight a war long after everyone else had given up. By December 1944, Hiroo found himself on a small island in the Philippines called Lubang. It was tiny, barely 48 square miles, but strategically important. The Americans were closing in, and the Japanese needed someone to hold the fort, so to speak. Hiroo's orders were clear: keep the enemy at bay and don't, under any circumstances, surrender. Those words were drilled into his head: never surrender.
I took this at face value, as I'm sure many other young Japanese men my age did. After all, this is what we Japanese had all vowed to each other. We had sworn that we would resist the American and English devils until the single last one of us was dead.
It wasn't just a command, it was a solemn vow he took to heart. The situation in Lubang wasn't pretty. The Americans were advancing fast, and it was clear that holding the island would be next to impossible. But for Onoda, failure wasn't an option. He was promoted to second lieutenant, and the responsibility of leading the remaining troops fell squarely on his shoulders. They were isolated, cut off from the rest of the world, but Hiroo wasn't about to let that stop him. In February 1945, as the war raged on, Onoda received his most critical order: engage in guerrilla warfare and hold out as long as possible. The message from his superior officer was chillingly clear: it may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we will come back for you. Until then, so long as you have one soldier, you are to continue leading them. This wasn't just an order, it was a lifeline, a promise that gave Hiroo a sense of purpose. And with that, he dug in, ready to fight for as long as it took. So, while Hiroo Onoda was out there in the jungles of Lubang Island, fighting with everything he had, the world was changing in ways he couldn't even begin to imagine. Back in Japan, the situation had turned desperate. By August 1945, the war was clearly not going in Japan's favor, and then came the bombings: Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th. These were no ordinary bombings. The United States had dropped atomic bombs on these cities, and the devastation was beyond anything the world had ever seen. In a matter of days, tens of thousands of lives were lost, and the cities were reduced to rubble. For the Japanese government, it was the final blow. They knew they couldn't continue the fight. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito made a public announcement over the radio: the war was over. Japan had surrendered unconditionally. It was a moment of shock and relief for millions, but for Hiroo Onoda and his men, tucked away in their jungle hideout, this news didn't reach them directly. The official surrender was signed on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri. With that, World War II was officially over. over. All over the world, people began to rebuild, to heal, and to move on. But on Lubang Island, Onoda and his small band of soldiers were still living as if nothing had changed. At some point after the surrender, leaflets started dropping from the sky over Lubang. These leaflets, written in Japanese, carried a simple message: the war ended on August 15th, come down from the mountains. But Onoda and his men weren't buying it. To them, this was just another trick by the enemy.
The leaflets they dropped were filled with mistakes, so I judged it was a plot by the Americans.
After all, they had been trained to distrust anything that wasn't directly from their superiors. The idea that Japan would surrender was unthinkable. They were convinced that these leaflets were a ruse designed to flush them out into the open. You have to understand the mindset here. Onoda had been drilled day in and day out with the idea that surrender was worse than death. The indoctrination was so deep that the very thought of Japan admitting defeat was absurd to him. And there was more at play too. Onoda had a profound sense of duty. He had been given orders, and in his mind, those orders were still active. Until someone he trusted told him otherwise, he wasn't going to give up.
We then formally wished each other a good year and renewed our pledge to do our best as soldiers. Meanwhile, in Japan, the public's reinvigorated interest in the Lubang stragglers sparked protests to bring them back home.
Over the next few months, the efforts to inform Onoda and his men about the end of the war escalated. Planes flew over the jungle, dropping more leaflets. Some of these leaflets even included orders directly from Japanese commanders telling them to surrender. Loudspeakers were brought in, broadcasting messages in Japanese, urging them to come out and assuring them that the war was over. But Onoda and his men were steadfast. Each new attempt was met with suspicion. They believed these messages were enemy propaganda, clever tricks meant to deceive them. The paranoia ran deep. They were isolated, exhausted, and living in constant fear of being discovered. In that state, it was easier to cling to the belief that the war was still on, that Japan would never surrender, than to accept the reality that everything they were fighting for was already lost. There were even personal letters dropped into the jungle, letters from their families begging them to come home. But Onoda's mindset was so rigid, so completely focused on his mission, that he dismissed these letters as fabrications. In his mind, the enemy had gone to great lengths to break their spirits, to lure them out with false hope. Onoda's belief in Japan's resilience, in the idea that they would never surrender, was unshakable. He held onto this belief with a grip so tight that no amount of leaflets, broadcasts, or letters could loosen it. And so he continued his mission, living in the jungle, waging a war that had long since ended everywhere else, but not in his mind. In the thick, unforgiving jungles of Lubang Island, Onoda and his men turned to guerrilla warfare. This wasn't about big battles or flashy heroics. It was about surviving and striking when the enemy least expected it. Onoda's training kicked in hard here. He divided his men into small mobile units, usually no more than 3 or 4 soldiers. The idea was simple: stay small, stay hidden, and strike fast. They'd carry out hit-and-run tactics, sabotaging whatever they could. Destroying bridges, raiding supply depots, and setting traps were all part of their playbook. The goal wasn't to win the war outright, that was impossible, but to keep the enemy on edge, to make their lives as difficult as possible. The men became experts in the art of ambush. They'd lie in wait for hours, sometimes days, until the perfect moment to strike. Then, in a flash, they'd attack and disappear back into the jungle before the enemy even knew what hit them. They used the dense foliage to their advantage, always staying one step ahead of the allied forces that were scouring the island. Onoda was meticulous, always thinking several moves ahead. Every raid, every ambush was planned with the precision of a chess game. He knew the jungle like the back of his hand, and he made sure his men did too. But fighting wasn't the only challenge. Living in the jungle day in and day out was a battle in itself. Food was scarce and supplies were constantly running low. The initial rations they had brought with them were long gone. Onoda and his men had to get creative. They hunted local wildlife, wild boars, chickens, even iguanas became part of their diet. But hunting wasn't easy. Ammunition was precious, so they had to make every shot count.
They traversed Lubang's mountainous jungles while remaining unseen by any and all search parties. Not a single trace of Onoda and Kazuka were found during this time. Thus, they were legally declared dead by the Bureau of Repatriate Welfare in 1959.
When they weren't hunting, they were scavenging. The jungle provided some fruits and vegetables, but it wasn't enough, so they began stealing from the local villagers. They'd sneak into the villages at night, taking rice, vegetables, and whatever else they could find. This, of course, didn't sit well with the locals, but to Onoda, it was necessary for survival. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine living in constant fear, always looking over your shoulder, never knowing if today might be the day you're finally caught. That's the life Onoda and his men men lived. They were isolated from the world, cut off from any form of communication, and the only thing keeping them going was their belief that they were still fighting for Japan. But with each passing day, that belief took a heavier toll. The loneliness, the paranoia, it all started to weigh on them. As the years dragged on, the relationship between Onoda's group and the local Filipino population grew increasingly hostile. At first, the locals were just scared of them, these mysterious soldiers hiding in the jungle attacking at random. But as time went on, fear turned to anger. The villagers were tired of having their food stolen, their livestock killed, and their lives disrupted. Skirmishes between Onoda's men and the locals became more common. The villagers started arming themselves and there were several bloody encounters. But despite the mounting hostility, Onoda refused to surrender. He was still convinced that the war was ongoing and that any day now, Japanese forces would return to relieve them. Over the years, Onoda's small band of soldiers grew even smaller. The jungle was unforgiving, and so was the passage of time. His men started to die, one by one. Some were killed in skirmishes with the villagers, others succumbed to illness or injuries that they couldn't treat in the wild. By 1972, only Onoda and his comrade, Private Kazuka, were left. Then, in October 1972, Kazuka was killed in a clash with local forces. It was a devastating blow for Onoda. He was now completely alone, the last remaining member of a unit that once numbered dozens. But even then, he refused to give up.
After I landed on Lubang at the end of 1944, I had no real knowledge of how the war was going. There was no news at all from the outside world for several years, and I did not believe the leaflets.
Kazuka's death only strengthened his resolve. In Onoda's mind, surrender was still not an option. He believed that he was carrying the weight of his entire country on his shoulders, and as long as he was alive, the fight had to continue. So, Onoda kept going, moving through the jungle, hiding from both the locals and the increasingly rare search parties that were still sent to find him. He was a ghost, haunting the island, clinging to a mission that had long since lost its meaning. But for Onoda, it was all he had left. By 1974, Hiroo Onoda had become a figure of myth, a soldier who continued fighting long after World War II had ended, hidden away in the jungles of Lubang Island. Most had given up hope of ever finding him, but then came Norio Suzuki, a young, adventurous Japanese man with a passion for chasing the impossible. Suzuki was an adventurous guy, known for going on bizarre missions. In his own words, he was looking for Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman in that order. So, with nothing more than his determination and a backpack, he flew to the Philippines and began his search. Unlike the military and government search parties before him, Suzuki had no official backing. He relied on the goodwill of locals and his own instincts. Incredibly, after just 4 days of trekking through the dense jungle, Suzuki stumbled upon a camp, and there, standing before him, was Hiroo Onoda, still dressed in his faded, patched-up Imperial Army uniform, rifle slung over his shoulder. Onoda hadn't seen another Japanese face in years, and he was immediately cautious, but Suzuki's approach was respectful and calm. Speaking in formal, polite Japanese, Suzuki managed to win Onoda's trust just enough to start a conversation. Suzuki and Onoda talked for hours, sitting in the shadow of the trees that had been Onoda's home for nearly 3 decades. Suzuki gently explained that the war had ended in 1945 and that Japan had surrendered, but Onoda wasn't easily convinced. For years, he had dismissed such claims as enemy propaganda, and his training and sense of duty were too strong to simply accept this stranger's word. Onoda insisted that he could not abandon his post without direct orders from his superior officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. This was a man he had respected deeply, and Onoda believed that only Taniguchi could relieve him of his duties. Suzuki understood the gravity of Onoda's mindset. This wasn't just stubbornness, it was a deeply ingrained sense of loyalty and military discipline. Suzuki knew he had to act. He promised Onoda that he would return with Taniguchi, the very man who had sent him on this mission all those years ago. Suzuki returned to Japan and managed to find Major Taniguchi, who had long since retired from the military and was now living a quiet life as a bookseller. Taniguchi was surprised but agreed to help. Together with Suzuki and a small team, he traveled back to Lubang Island, determined to bring Onoda home. When they reached the island, Onoda was waiting, still armed and in uniform, as disciplined as ever. When Taniguchi stepped forward and saluted, Onoda stood at attention, ready for whatever orders came next. With a firm voice, Taniguchi read out the orders that Onoda had been waiting nearly 30 years to hear. The 14th Area Army has ceased all combat activity. All units under your command are to cease military operations immediately. immediately and surrender to the nearest allied forces. For Onoda, these were the words he needed. It was only after hearing them from the man he trusted most that he allowed himself to believe that the war was truly over. On March 9, 1974, Hiroo Onoda, still clad in his Imperial Army uniform, marched out of the jungle and formally surrendered to Philippine authorities. He handed over his rifle, a dagger, and 500 rounds of ammunition, all meticulously maintained despite the passage of time. The world was stunned. Here was a man who had lived in hiding for 29 years, surviving on wild game and stolen rice, all because he believed he was still serving his country. In the Philippines, Onoda's surrender was met with a mix of astonishment and relief. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, recognizing the extraordinary circumstances, granted Onoda a full pardon for the acts of war he had committed, including several shootouts with local villagers. Back in Japan, Onoda returned to a hero's welcome, although his long holdout also sparked debates. Some saw him as a symbol of unwavering loyalty and dedication, while others questioned the cost of his actions, both to himself and to those around him. Japan had changed drastically in the 30 years since Onoda had last seen it, and the adjustment to this new world was not easy for him. Despite the challenges, Onoda's story became a lasting legend, a testament to the complexities of duty, honor, and the human spirit's capacity to endure, even when the world moves on. When Hiroo Onoda finally returned to Japan in March 1974, he stepped into a world that had moved far beyond the war he had never stopped fighting. His return was nothing short of a national sensation. The media couldn't get enough of him. Here was a man who had become a living symbol of loyalty and perseverance, embodying the samurai spirit of Bushido. Crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of him as he arrived back on Japanese soil, and parades were held in his honor. It was as if a hero from an ancient tale had come back to life. Onoda's unwavering dedication to his mission resonated deeply with the Japanese people. Despite the controversial nature of his long holdout, many admired him for his steadfastness and his refusal to abandon his duty. In a post-war Japan that had undergone massive changes, Onoda's story struck a chord with those who still valued the traditional ideals of honor, loyalty, and sacrifice. Public speeches were made and interviews were given, all celebrating Onoda's return as a triumph of the human spirit over time and adversity. However, the Japan Onoda returned to was not the Japan he had left behind. In the 30 years since he had gone into the jungle, Japan had transformed from a war-torn country into a modern, bustling economic powerhouse. The cities were filled with skyscrapers, neon lights, and a culture that had increasingly embraced Western ideals and lifestyles. For Onoda, who had spent nearly 3 decades surviving in a jungle with nothing but his rifle and his resolve, the shock of this new world was overwhelming. He struggled to adjust to the fast-paced modern society that Japan had become. The values he had lived by, loyalty, duty, and honor, seemed out of place in a country that had moved on from its militaristic past. Onoda found it difficult to connect with the younger generation, who saw the world through a lens shaped by peace and prosperity, not war and sacrifice. In interviews, Onoda often reflected on his time in the jungle and the war's outcome. He didn't express regret for his actions, but rather a sense of confusion and dislocation. The world had changed, but his mindset was still rooted in the Japan of the 1940s.
Japan's philosophy and ideas changed dramatically after World War II. That philosophy clashed with mine.
He spoke of his mission as something he had to do, driven by the orders he had received and the values instilled in him as a soldier. But it was clear that adjusting to this new reality was not easy for him. Perhaps seeking a fresh start, Onoda made a surprising decision in 1975. He moved to Brazil. He joined his older brother Tadao, who had established a successful cattle ranch in the rural area of Terrenos, Mato Grosso do Sul. The contrast between Onoda's life as a soldier and his new life as a cattle rancher couldn't have been starker. Gone were the days of military discipline and survival tactics. Now, his life revolved around the peaceful routines of ranching. In Brazil, Onoda found a sense of peace and purpose that had eluded him in Japan. The vast open landscapes and the simple life on the ranch provided a kind of solace. He married a Japanese woman named Machi, and together they built a life far removed from the chaos and struggles of his past. Onoda even became a respected member of the local Japanese Brazilian community, known for his quiet demeanor and hard-working nature. Despite his new life in Brazil, Onoda's connection to Japan and his past never faded. In 1984, he and his wife returned to Japan, where they established the Onoda Nature School, a camp dedicated to teaching young people survival skills and the importance of living in harmony with nature. Onoda believed in passing on the knowledge and values that had sustained him during his years in the jungle, hoping to instill in the younger generation a sense of resilience and self-reliance. In 1996, Onoda made a significant significant gesture of reconciliation. He returned to Lubang Island, the place where he had spent nearly 30 years of his life in hiding. This time, he came not as a soldier, but as a friend. Onoda donated $10,000 to the local community, a gesture of goodwill and a symbol of the peace that had finally been achieved. It was a moment of closure for both Onoda and the people of Lubang, who had lived for years with the consequences of his long holdout. Hiru Onoda lived out the rest of his days in the Japan he had once fought so hard to protect, passing away peacefully at the age of 91 on January 16, 2014. His death quietly closed the final chapter of a story that still sparks conversation today. Some people see him as a hero, a man who refused to abandon his mission no matter the cost. Others view his story as a sobering lesson in the dangers of holding on too tightly to the past. But whether you see him as a hero or as a moral lesson, there's no denying that Hiru Onoda's life was anything but ordinary. His journey forces us to think about what it means to truly believe in something and how far we're willing to go when we think we're doing the right thing, even when the rest of the world has moved on.